The amber glow of the Oxford Faculty Lounge cast long shadows across worn leather chairs as the evening symposium wound down. Most attendees had filtered out into the crisp autumn night, their conversations about consciousness and ethics trailing behind them like smoke. But in the far corner, two figures remained seated across from each other, neither willing to concede the philosophical ground they had been defending all evening. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, adjusted his reading glasses and leaned back in his chair. At 67, the Persian polymath carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades bridging the worlds of medicine, philosophy, and theology. His dark eyes, sharp despite his age, fixed on the man across from him with genuine curiosity rather than antagonism. Immanuel Kant, younger by several years but appearing older with his meticulously powdered hair and rigid posture, set down his teacup with characteristic precision. The German philosopher had travelled far from his beloved Königsberg for this gathering, and the journey seemed to have sharpened rather than dulled his argumentative edge. "You know, Herr Kant," Avicenna said, his accented English warm with amusement, "when they told me I would be debating the author of the Critique of Pure Reason tonight, I expected a more—" He gestured vaguely with his hand, searching for the word. "Dogmatic approach?" Kant supplied, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I find that reputation precedes me in the most unflattering ways, though I must admit I was expecting someone more willing to bend their principles to accommodate reason." The barb landed gently, wrapped as it was in academic courtesy, but both men recognized the challenge being issued. Around them, the lounge had grown quiet except for the occasional clink of glassware as the few remaining scholars settled in for what promised to be an intellectual duel. Avicenna chuckled, a sound rich with genuine appreciation for his opponent's wit. "Ah, but that assumes my principles require bending. Perhaps it is reason itself that must stretch to accommodate truth." "And there we have it," Kant said, leaning forward slightly. "The fundamental question that has been lurking beneath our entire evening's discussion. When we speak of morality, of right and wrong, of what we ought to do, are we discovering something that exists independent of our reasoning, or are we constructing it through the very act of rational thought?" The moderator, a young philosophy professor who had been hovering nearby, started to approach their table, perhaps sensing an opportunity to record this impromptu continuation of the evening's formal debate. But Avicenna caught his eye and shook his head almost imperceptibly. This was not for posterity or academic records. This was two minds honed by decades of inquiry, meeting in the most honest way possible. "Let me be plain," Avicenna said, switching to a more conversational tone as he settled deeper into his chair. "I have spent my life studying the natural world, the human body, the movements of celestial spheres. In all of this I see order, purpose, design. When I encounter a moral truth, that compassion is good, that justice matters, that we ought to care for the vulnerable, it strikes me with the same force as discovering that the heart has 4 chambers or that light travels in straight lines. These are not human inventions, my friend. They are discoveries." Kant's expression remained thoughtful, his fingers drumming silently against the arm of his chair. "But surely you see the danger in that position. If moral truths are simply given to us, discovered rather than reasoned, then what prevents the tyrant from claiming divine sanction for his cruelties? What stops the fanatic from justifying any horror by appealing to a higher source?" "The same thing that prevents a physician from claiming that poison heals," Avicenna replied without hesitation. "Truth has a way of revealing itself to those who seek it honestly. The tyrant and the fanatic are not discovering moral truths. They are creating convenient fictions. But the person who truly submits to the divine order, who seeks to understand rather than to justify their desires, they find something quite different." The German philosopher's eyebrows rose slightly. "Submit. An interesting choice of words from someone who has challenged established thinking in so many fields. You speak as if reason must bow before revelation, yet your own work suggests a mind that bows before nothing but evidence and logic." For the first time since they had begun talking, Avicenna paused, his gaze drifting toward the tall windows where the last light of day was fading into darkness. When he looked back at Kant, there was something deeper in his expression, something that suggested they were approaching the heart of the matter. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we should examine what we mean by submission and what we mean by reason, because I suspect, Herr Kant, that you and I may not be as far apart as we first appeared." Kant's smile was genuine now, transforming his austere features. Now that, my dear Ibn Sina, sounds like the beginning of a proper philosophical investigation. The fire in the lounge's hearth crackled softly as both men settled into what they both recognized would be a long and substantive conversation. Avicenna gestured toward the serving table, where a selection of late-evening refreshments had been laid out by the college staff. "If we are to do this properly," he said, rising to pour himself another cup of tea, "we should probably start with the question that underlies all others. Where do moral obligations come from? What makes something right or wrong, not merely customary or preferred, but genuinely binding on our conscience?" Kant remained seated, but his attention was complete. "A fair starting point, and I suspect you would answer that such obligations flow from the divine nature itself, that God's commands create the very categories of right and wrong." "Not quite," Avicenna said, returning to his chair with renewed energy. "You are thinking of what your Christian contemporaries call divine command theory, yes? The idea that something is good simply because God wills it to be so, but this misunderstands the relationship between the divine and the moral." He leaned forward, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. "Consider this. When I say that kindness is good, I'm not saying that God arbitrarily decided to prefer kindness over cruelty. Rather, kindness is good because it reflects something essential about the divine nature itself. God does not create goodness through whim or decree. God is goodness, is justice, is truth. Moral law flows from divine essence just as natural law flows from divine wisdom." Kant's expression grew more animated. "But you see, this is precisely where I must part ways with you. You have simply pushed the problem back one step. If goodness is somehow inherent in God's nature, then either that nature is itself subject to some higher standard of evaluation, in which case God is not ultimate, or it is beyond evaluation entirely, in which case we return to the arbitrary." "Ah, but you assume that everything must be subject to evaluation by some external standard," Avicenna countered. "This is the mistake of treating the divine as simply another object in the world, subject to the same categories we apply to created things. The divine is not good in the way that honey is sweet or fire is hot. Rather, goodness itself finds its source and definition in the divine nature." Kant shook his head, though not without respect for the subtlety of his opponent's position. "You speak eloquently, but I fear you are making my point for me. If we cannot evaluate divine nature by any standard external to itself, then how can we distinguish genuine divine truth from self-serving human claims about divine truth? How does the sincere seeker differ from the manipulative priest or the deluded fanatic? Through reason," Avicenna said simply, and then smiled at Kant's look of surprise. "You seem startled that I would invoke your favorite tool, but I have never suggested that reason and divine truth are opposed. Quite the contrary, reason is itself a divine gift, the very capacity that allows us to recognize truth when we encounter it." He stood and walked to the window, where the college grounds lay in shadow beneath a canopy of stars. "When I study anatomy, I use reason to understand what I observe. When I work through a logical proof, I use reason to move from premises to conclusions. And when I encounter a moral truth, say that I ought to help the suffering rather than ignore them, I use reason to recognize its validity and to understand its implications." "But where does the initial truth come from?" Kant pressed. "You say you recognize it through reason, but what is it that you are recognizing? If it comes from divine command, then we are back to the problem of distinguishing genuine commands from false ones. If it comes from human nature, then why not simply ground morality in human nature itself?" Avicenna turned back from the window, his face thoughtful. "Because human nature is both finite and corrupted. We are capable of reasoning about moral truth, yes, but we are also capable of self-deception, of rationalization, of mistaking our desires for our duties. When I ground morality in the divine, I am not appealing to arbitrary commands, but to a source of truth that transcends human limitation and bias." "And yet," Kant said, "you still have not solved the fundamental problem. Even if we grant that divine nature is somehow the source of moral truth, we still need some way of distinguishing genuine insights into that nature from false ones, and any such way must ultimately rely on our own rational capacities." The two men looked at each other across the space between their chairs, each recognizing that they had reached the first crucial juncture in their debate. The question was no longer simply about the source of moral truth, but about the relationship between divine authority and human reason, between transcendent standards and finite understanding. "Perhaps," Avicenna said slowly, The question is not whether reason or revelation should be primary, but whether they can work together in ways that neither of us has yet fully articulated. Kant nodded thoughtfully. Or perhaps the question is whether what you call divine truth and what I call rational law are actually referring to the same underlying reality, approached from different angles. Avicenna returned to his seat, but the energy of the discussion had him leaning forward, hands clasped as he prepared to lay out the heart of his position. The fire cast dancing shadows on his face as he spoke, giving weight to his words. "Let me try to show you something, my friend," he began. "When you perform surgery, as I know you have studied medicine, you discover that the body has a certain order, a certain logic. The heart must pump in a particular rhythm, the lungs must expand and contract in a specific pattern. This is not arbitrary. There is a rightness to it that you can feel in your hands as well as understand with your mind." Kant shifted in his chair, intrigued despite himself. "I follow you thus far. Now, when I encounter a moral situation," Avicenna continued, "I experience something remarkably similar. When I see a child in distress and feel compelled to help, when I witness injustice and feel outrage, when I observe kindness and feel recognition, these are not mere emotions or social conditioning. They are responses to something as real and structured as the anatomy of the heart." He paused, searching for the right way to express what had taken him decades to understand. "You see, the divine nature is not some distant, unknowable mystery. It is the very foundation of reality itself, the source from which all order, all beauty, all truth emanates. When we encounter moral truth, we are not discovering arbitrary commands, but recognizing the patterns that underlie existence itself." "But surely you see the circularity," Kant interjected. "You say we recognize divine patterns, but how do we know our recognition is accurate? What prevents us from mistaking our own biases for divine insight?" Avicenna smiled, clearly having anticipated this objection. "The same way we know our recognition is accurate in any other domain, through careful observation, logical analysis, and the test of consequences. When the physician correctly understands the body's requirements, the patient heals. When the philosopher correctly grasps logical relationships, the conclusions follow necessarily. And when the moral agent correctly apprehends divine truth, the result is human flourishing in its deepest sense." He stood again, pacing slowly as his excitement grew. "Consider compassion. Why is it that across cultures, across centuries, across vast differences in custom and belief, human beings consistently recognize compassion as virtuous? Not mere kindness, which can be manipulated, not mere sentiment, which can be misguided, but true compassion, the ability to feel the suffering of another and to be moved to alleviate it. You could explain that through evolutionary psychology," Kant suggested. "Social cooperation requires empathy, so natural selection would favor—" But you are explaining why we might have evolved the capacity for compassion, not why compassion is actually good," Avicenna interrupted. "Evolution might explain why we feel protective toward our offspring, but does that make such protection morally right? Or might it simply be that evolution tends to align with moral truth because the universe itself is structured morally?" The question hung in the air between them, and Kant found himself genuinely considering it. There was something compelling about Avicenna's vision of a reality shot through with purpose and meaning, where moral truth was as fundamental as mathematical truth or physical law. "Let me try another approach," Avicenna said, sensing his companion's engagement. "So have written extensively about the categorical imperative, the idea that we should act only according to principles we could will to be universal laws. This is elegant, powerful reasoning. But tell me, why should we care about universalizability? Why should the fact that everyone could follow a principle make it morally binding?" Kant frowned, recognizing that this struck at something central to his system. "Because rational beings must be consistent. To make an exception for oneself is to violate the very nature of reason itself." "But why should we be rational?" Avicenna pressed gently. "Why should consistency matter? You see, even your categorical imperative seems to depend on something prior to reason, a recognition that rational consistency has value, that it matters whether our actions can be universalized. Where does this recognition come from?" The German philosopher was quiet for a long moment, his analytical mind working through the implications. "You are suggesting that even pure rational ethics depends on some kind of moral intuition about the value of reason itself." "Precisely," Avicenna said, his voice warm with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student has grasped a difficult concept. "And I would suggest that this intuition, This immediate recognition that truth matters, that consistency has value, that persons deserve respect, comes from our participation in the divine nature itself. We are not simply biological machines that have learned to cooperate. We are beings created in the image of truth itself, and it is this divine spark that allows us to recognize moral reality when we encounter it. Kant remained silent, but his expression showed that he was taking the argument seriously. The question was no longer simply whether morality required divine foundation, but whether his own rational system might itself depend on insights that transcended pure reason. Of course, Avicenna added with a slight smile, this does not mean that reason is unimportant. The divine nature is supremely rational. It is the source of all logic and order. But it is also the source of the very values that make rational inquiry worthwhile in the first place. Kant had been quiet for several minutes, his fingers steepled as he worked through the implications of Avicenna's argument. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the measured confidence of someone who had found his footing on familiar ground. "I appreciate the elegance of your position," he began slowly, "and I confess there is something attractive about grounding morality in a reality larger than ourselves. But I fear you have constructed a beautiful castle on foundations of sand." He leaned back in his chair, gathering his thoughts. "The fundamental problem with your approach is that it places moral authority outside the reach of rational evaluation. Even if we grant that divine nature exists and serves as the source of moral truth, we are still left with the insurmountable problem of determining what that nature actually demands of us." Avicenna opened his mouth to respond, but Kant raised a gentle hand. "Let me finish this thought. Throughout history, earnest and intelligent people have claimed divine insight into moral truth, yet they have reached contradictory conclusions. Some say the divine commands absolute pacifism. Others claim it demands holy war. Some insist it requires strict adherence to revealed law. Others claim it transcends all human rules. How are we to adjudicate between these competing claims? Through reason and—" Avicenna began. "Exactly," Kant interrupted with satisfaction. "Through reason. But if we must use reason to evaluate claims about divine moral truth, then reason itself becomes the ultimate arbiter of moral validity. And if reason is the ultimate arbiter, then we no longer need the divine foundation at all." The German philosopher stood and walked to the mantelpiece, his hands clasped behind his back, in a gesture that was characteristic when he was building toward a crucial point. "Consider what happens when we try to determine whether an action is morally right. We cannot simply consult a divine command, because we must first determine whether the purported command is authentic. We cannot rely on religious authority, because we must first evaluate whether that authority is legitimate. We cannot trust our moral intuitions, because we must first distinguish genuine moral insight from wishful thinking or cultural conditioning." He turned back to face Avicenna, his expression intense but not hostile. "At every step, we are thrown back upon our own rational capacities. We must ask, is this command consistent with itself? Does it treat rational beings with appropriate respect? Can it be universalized without contradiction? Could any reasonable person, thinking clearly and without bias, accept this principle? But that assumes reason is capable of generating moral truth from nothing," Avicenna objected. "You speak as if we could derive aught from value from fact, through pure logical analysis. Yet your own critique of pure reason showed the limits of what thinking alone can accomplish." Kant smiled slightly, clearly pleased that his opponent had engaged seriously with his earlier work. "You misunderstand what I mean by practical reason. I'm not claiming that we can derive specific moral conclusions from purely logical premises. Rather, I am saying that the very structure of rational agency itself generates moral obligations." He began pacing slowly, his voice taking on the rhythm of a lecturer who had refined his argument through years of teaching. "Consider what it means to be a rational agent. To be rational is to act according to principles rather than mere impulse. But what kind of principles can a truly rational being accept? Only those that could be endorsed by any rational agent whatsoever. And this requirement of universal endorsement gives us the categorical imperative: act only according to principles you could will to be universal laws. This is not an arbitrary rule imposed from outside," he continued, his excitement growing. "It flows necessarily from the concept of rational agency itself. To be rational just is to be committed to principled action. To be committed to principled action just is to be committed to universalizable principles. And to be committed to universalizable principles just is to respect the rational agency of all persons. Avicenna listened carefully, his respect for his opponent's systematic thinking evident in his expression. "I grant that this is internally consistent," he said finally, "but it seems to me that you have simply relocated the mystery rather than solving it. Why should we value rational agency? Why should the fact that we can reason create any obligations at all?" "Because," Kant replied with the confidence of someone who had wrestled with this question for decades, "to ask that question is to presuppose the very thing you are questioning. The moment you engage in moral reasoning, the moment you ask whether something matters or whether we ought to care about it, you are already operating within the framework of rational agency. You cannot coherently question the value of reason without using reason to formulate your question." He returned to his chair, leaning forward with intensity. "This is what I mean by the categorical nature of moral obligation. It is not hypothetical. It does not depend on your desires or goals or beliefs about divine will. It is built into the very structure of rational thought itself. To be a thinking being is to be bound by moral law, not because some external authority commands it, but because moral law is constitutive of what it means to think at all." The room fell quiet, except for the crackling of the fire. Both men sensed that they had reached another crucial juncture in their discussion, where fundamental commitments about the nature of reason, reality, and moral obligation came into sharp focus. "You present a powerful case," Avicenna said thoughtfully, "but I wonder whether you have not proven too much. If moral obligation flows necessarily from rational agency, then it seems to follow that any being capable of reason must discover exactly the same moral truths. Yet we observe significant moral disagreement even among highly rational people." Kant nodded slowly. "A fair challenge, and one that brings us to the heart of what may be our deepest disagreement." The fire had burned lower while they talked, casting longer shadows across the lounge. Both men had removed their jackets as the evening wore on, settling into the kind of intellectual comfort that comes when two sharp minds find themselves well matched. "Let me press you on this universality claim," Avicenna said, his tone remaining conversational despite the sharpness of his challenge. "You say that rational agency itself generates moral obligations that must be the same for all thinking beings. But when I look at the world, I see rational people reaching profoundly different conclusions about fundamental moral questions." He counted off on his fingers as he spoke. "Take the question of whether we have obligations to future generations we will never meet, or whether individual rights should ever be subordinated to collective welfare, or whether mercy should sometimes override strict justice. These are not questions where one side is obviously irrational, yet rational people disagree deeply." Kant shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the force of the objection. Disagreement does not necessarily indicate that there is no correct answer. Perhaps it simply means that some people are reasoning poorly, or that they are allowing non-rational factors to influence their judgment. But that brings us back to my earlier point," Avicenna said with evident satisfaction. "If we must distinguish good reasoning from poor reasoning, if we must separate rational judgment from bias and self-interest, then we need some standard external to reasoning itself. We need something that can guide and correct our rational processes." He leaned forward, his voice growing more intense. "This is what I mean by divine illumination. Not some mystical revelation that bypasses thinking altogether, but a kind of moral vision that allows us to see when our reasoning is on the right track. Just as we have intellectual intuitions that allow us to recognize logical validity, we have moral intuitions that allow us to recognize ethical truth. But intuitions can deceive," Kant objected. "Throughout history, people have had strong moral intuitions that we now recognize as deeply mistaken. Intuitions about racial hierarchy, about the subordination of women, about the acceptability of slavery. If we ground morality in intuition, how do we distinguish genuine insight from prejudice?" Avicenna nodded, acknowledging the difficulty. "The same way we distinguish genuine intellectual insight from wishful thinking in any other domain, through careful reflection, through dialogue with others, through attention to consequences, through the test of time. The fact that moral intuitions can be corrupted does not mean they are always unreliable, any more than the fact that our senses can deceive us means that empirical observation is worthless." He stood and walked to the window again, looking out at the darkened college grounds. "Let me try to show you what I mean through an example. When you see a person in genuine distress, not feigned suffering designed to manipulate you, but real anguish, do you not feel an immediate recognition that this matters, that you ought to respond?" This is not a conclusion you reach through rational argument. It is a direct perception of moral reality. I feel sympathy, Kant admitted, but feeling and obligation are different things. The mere fact that someone's suffering moves me does not create a duty to alleviate it. That duty, if it exists, must be grounded in something more than emotion. But I am not talking about emotion, Avicenna insisted, turning back to face his companion. I am talking about recognition, the same kind of cognitive act that allows you to see that a mathematical proof is valid, or that a logical argument is sound. When you encounter genuine moral truth, there is an immediate apprehension that this is how things ought to be, independent of your desires or preferences or cultural conditioning. Kant was quiet for a long moment, considering this carefully. Even if we grant that such moral perception exists, he said finally, we still face the problem of validation. How do we know when our perception is accurate? How do we distinguish genuine moral insight from self-serving rationalization or cultural bias? Through reason, Avicenna replied. But reason informed and guided by moral vision, not reason operating in isolation. You see, I think your mistake is in treating reason as if it were some purely formal procedure that could operate independently of any substantive understanding of value or purpose. He returned to his chair, settling in for what he clearly intended to be a sustained argument. Consider how reasoning actually works in practice. When you construct a moral argument, you do not begin with purely formal premises. You begin with substantive judgments about what matters, that suffering is bad, that persons deserve respect, that consistency has value. These are not conclusions you reach through reasoning. They are starting points that make reasoning possible. But those starting points can be rationally evaluated, Kant protested. We can ask whether they are consistent with each other, whether they can be universalized, whether they treat all rational agents equally. Yes, but the criteria you use for evaluation, consistency, universalizability, equal treatment, are themselves value judgments, Avicenna pointed out. Why should consistency matter more than tradition? Why should universalizability matter more than particular relationships? Why should equal treatment matter more than excellence or achievement? These preferences cannot be derived from pure logic. They reflect substantive commitments about what kinds of values are worthy of rational beings. The challenge hung in the air between them, and both men recognized that they had reached the deepest level of their disagreement. It was not simply about whether morality required divine foundation, but about whether reason itself could be truly autonomous or whether it always operated within frameworks of meaning and value that transcended its formal procedures. Perhaps, Kant said slowly, we are approaching the question from opposite directions but arriving at something similar. You ground reason in divine truth. I ground moral truth in the structure of reason itself. But both of us are trying to find something that transcends mere preference or convention. Avicenna nodded thoughtfully. The question is whether reason can truly bootstrap itself into moral significance, or whether it requires some external source of meaning to make its operations worthwhile. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 11 times, its sound echoing through the nearly empty lounge. Neither man seemed inclined to end their conversation, despite the lateness of the hour. If anything, the depth of their engagement had only intensified as they had moved closer to the fundamental assumptions underlying their philosophical systems. Let me try a different approach, Kant said, settling back in his chair with the air of someone preparing for a final assault on a difficult problem. Perhaps we can find common ground by examining what we both take to be paradigm cases of moral clarity. Avicenna raised an eyebrow, intrigued by this tactical shift. Go on. Consider promise-keeping, Kant continued. Surely we both agree that there is something morally significant about honoring one's commitments, even when doing so is inconvenient or costly. The question is, what makes promise-keeping morally required rather than merely prudent or customary? An excellent example, Avicenna agreed. From my perspective, the obligation to keep promises flows from our participation in divine truth itself. God is absolutely faithful. Divine promises are never broken. Divine commitments never wavered from. When we honor our own promises, we reflect this aspect of divine nature. When we break them casually, we corrupt our own souls and damage the fabric of trust that holds communities together. Kant nodded slowly. I can respect that analysis, even if I cannot accept its foundations. From my perspective, the obligation flows from the nature of promising itself. To make a promise is to commit oneself to acting according to a certain principle, but the only principles that rational beings can coherently commit to are those they could will to be universal laws, and a world in which promise-breaking was universally practiced would be one in which the institution of promising itself would collapse. Interesting, Avicenna mused. So we reach the same practical conclusion, but through different reasoning. You might say that promise-keeping is required because universal promise-breaking is self-contradictory, while I would say it is required because faithfulness reflects divine nature. But both analyses treat promise-keeping as genuinely obligatory rather than merely conventional. Exactly, Kant said with evident satisfaction, and this suggests something important about the structure of moral reasoning itself. Whether we ground obligation in divine nature or in rational consistency, we are both committed to the idea that moral requirements transcend individual preference and cultural convention. Avicenna leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. But do you not see what this suggests about the limitations of pure rational analysis? Your categorical imperative provides a test for evaluating proposed moral principles, but it cannot tell us which principles to test in the first place. Why focus on promise-keeping rather than, say, aesthetic appreciation or athletic excellence? Because promise-keeping involves treating other persons as rational agents, Kant replied. It respects their capacity to make plans and form expectations based on our commitments. Aesthetic appreciation, while valuable, does not engage this fundamental aspect of rational agency. But why should respecting rational agency be morally significant? Avicenna pressed. You say it flows from the nature of rationality itself, but I think you are smuggling in a substantive value judgment that rational agency deserves respect, which cannot itself be derived from pure reason. Kant paused, recognizing the depth of this challenge. Perhaps, but if I am smuggling in value judgments, so are you. When you claim that faithfulness reflects divine nature, you are assuming that divine nature is morally authoritative. Why should the fact that God keeps promises make promise-keeping obligatory for us? Because God is the source of our being and the ground of all value, Avicenna replied. To act in accordance with divine nature is to act in accordance with our own deepest nature as rational, moral creatures. This is not arbitrary command, but recognition of what we truly are. And I would say that to act rationally is to act in accordance with our nature as autonomous moral agents, Kant countered. The categorical imperative is not imposed from outside, but flows from our own rational will when it operates freely and consistently. They looked at each other across the space between their chairs, each recognizing that they had perhaps reached the limits of what argument alone could accomplish. Their disagreement was not merely about particular moral principles, but about the fundamental nature of reality itself, whether the universe was ultimately structured by divine purpose or by the requirements of rational consistency. You know, Avicenna said finally, I think we may be closer than we initially appeared. We both believe that morality involves more than individual preference or social convention. We both think that moral truths, when we discover them, are binding on all rational beings. We both take seriously the idea that moral reasoning can lead us toward objective truth rather than mere opinion. Kant nodded slowly. The difference is that you locate the source of that objectivity in divine nature, while I locate it in the structure of rational agency itself. But perhaps these are not as different as they initially seem. How so? Well, Kant said thoughtfully, if divine nature is supremely rational, as you claim, then divine commands would necessarily conform to the requirements of rational consistency. And if rational agency is our highest capacity, as I claim, then perhaps it participates in something that transcends mere human construction. Avicenna smiled, recognizing the philosophical sophistication of this suggestion. So you might be willing to consider that what you call the moral law and what I call divine nature are two ways of referring to the same underlying reality. I might, Kant admitted, though I would still insist that we can only access that reality through our own rational processes, not through special revelation or mystical insight. And I would still insist that our rational processes are themselves gifts that require something beyond pure reason to make them morally significant, Avicenna replied. But perhaps that is a difference in emphasis rather than substance. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a warm but dimmer light across the two philosophers as they entered what both sensed would be the final movement of their extended conversation. The college grounds outside had grown completely quiet, and even the distant sounds of Oxford's nightlife had faded to silence. Before we conclude, Avicenna said, I want to return to something you said earlier about moral disagreement. You suggested that rational people might disagree about ethics because some are reasoning poorly or allowing bias to influence their judgment. But I wonder if there might be another explanation. Kant looked at him expectantly. Perhaps, Avicenna continued, moral truth is like light passing through a prism. The light itself is unified and coherent, but when it encounters the particular circumstances of human life, different cultures, different historical periods, different individual experiences, it refracts into what appears to be a spectrum of different conclusions. He stood and walked to the window one final time, looking out at the star-filled sky. This would explain why we see both moral universals, prohibitions against murder, requirements of care for children, values of honesty and courage, and moral particulars that vary from culture to culture. The underlying moral reality is constant, but its application must take account of varying circumstances and human limitations. That is an intriguing metaphor, Kant admitted, and it suggests a way of thinking about moral reasoning that might incorporate insights from both our perspectives. The moral law, whether we ground it in divine nature or rational structure, provides the underlying unity, but the application of that law requires careful attention to particular circumstances and genuine respect for the complexity of human life. Avicenna turned back from the window with evident satisfaction. Exactly. And this means that both revelation and reason, both divine guidance and human analysis, both moral intuition and careful argument, all have roles to play in our ongoing effort to understand what we owe to each other. I can accept that, Kant said, provided we maintain that reason must serve as the final arbiter of any claims about moral truth. Even if moral insight comes through intuition or tradition or religious experience, it must still pass the test of rational consistency and universal applicability. And I can accept that, Avicenna replied, provided we recognize that reason itself operates within a framework of meaning and value that it does not create but discovers. The capacity to reason about morality is itself a gift that points beyond human construction towards something genuinely transcendent. Both men were quiet for a moment, sensing that they had reached not a resolution, but a kind of respectful recognition of the depth and complexity of the issues they had been exploring. Their disagreement remained, but it had been transformed from simple opposition into something more like complementary perspectives on a mystery too large for either approach to fully encompass. You know, Kant said finally, when I first encountered your writings on the relationship between philosophy and theology, I must confess I expected to find the kind of dogmatic thinking that subordinates reason to authority. Instead, I find a mind that takes both divine truth and rational analysis seriously in ways that enrich rather than diminish each other. Avicenna smiled warmly. And I expected to find the kind of purely secular thinking that reduces morality to human convention or biological programming. Instead, I find a philosophy that takes moral obligations seriously enough to ground it in the very structure of rational agency itself. Perhaps we are both trying to honor the same fundamental insight, that morality matters in ways that transcend individual preference and cultural accident. Perhaps, Kant agreed, though I suspect we will continue to disagree about whether that transcendence points toward God or toward reason as its ultimate source. Probably, Avicenna acknowledged, but maybe that disagreement is less important than our shared commitment to the reality of moral truth and the possibility of discovering it through careful thought and honest inquiry. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each processing the evening's conversation and what it had revealed about both their own positions and those of their intellectual opponent. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear on the eastern horizon, though neither man seemed ready to acknowledge that their remarkable dialogue was coming to an end. I think, Avicenna said finally, that anyone listening to our conversation tonight would come away understanding that the question of whether morality depends on God or reason alone is not one that admits of easy answers. Both perspectives capture something essential about moral experience, and both face challenges that should give their advocates pause. Kant nodded in agreement. What matters most, perhaps, is not that we resolve the disagreement, but that we approach it with the kind of intellectual honesty and mutual respect that allows genuine learning to take place. Too often, debates about religion and morality generate more heat than light. Indeed, Avicenna said, rising from his chair and extending his hand to his companion. Thank you for a truly illuminating evening. I've not had my thinking challenged so thoroughly or so charitably in a very long time. Kant stood as well, grasping the offered hand warmly. The pleasure has been entirely mutual. Perhaps the most important thing we can say to those who will wrestle with these questions after us is this: the search for moral truth is too important to be abandoned to either dogmatism or skepticism. It requires the best of both rational analysis and spiritual insight, and it demands the kind of intellectual humility that recognizes how much we still have to learn. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the lounge, both men carried with them not answers, but better questions. Not victory, but wisdom. Not certainty, but the kind of understanding that comes only through genuine engagement, with minds equally committed to truth and equally aware of their own limitations. The debate between divine foundation and rational autonomy in ethics would continue long after their voices faded into the morning silence, but it would be enriched by their demonstration that such fundamental disagreements need not become barriers to mutual respect and continued learning.